Hello, everyone. I'm Zhao Chuang. Today, let's learn about Fergus the Acrocanthosaurus. Acrocanthosaurus was a very large carcharodontosaurid dinosaur. The largest specimen shows that its body size could be close to that of Tyrannosaurus rex, and it could reach 12 meters long. Acrocanthosaurus was also one of the most well-known carcharodontosaurids. Its fossils are preserved quite intact among carcharodontosaurids, so that we can reconstruct this animal more accurately. First, let's take a look at its head. Acrocanthosaurus had a particularly well-preserved skull which is rarely seen. This skull shows the similarity to that of Carcharodontosaurus, both of which had relatively rectangular heads. Especially its chin and the posterior part of the lower jaw were very thick, suggesting that it could have attached more powerful muscles while it was alive, giving it a stronger bite. Its eyes were not large, and the eye sockets were not, either. Based on the calculation of its sclerotic rings, we know that the exposed part of its eye was smaller. Its eyes looked small and maybe round. In front of its eyes, there was a relatively blunt lacrimal horn. Above the eyes, there was a lump, and while it was alive, the lump was probably connected to the lacrimal horn, and the surface was covered with a layer of keratins, like this, extending all the way to the front. This keratin might have a quite vivid color. On the fossils we can see that the lacrimal horn was not very large, but there were many rough protrusions on the surface. This rough surface allowed it to attach more keratins. Therefore, when reconstructing, we can make it more exaggerated and larger. In the anterior of its oral cavity, there might be large scales similar to those found on tyrannosaurs. Because the sides of its face were relatively rough and there were many dents on it, this might lead to a relatively rough surface, resembling crocodiles. The skull's fossils are so well preserved, so we can accurately reconstruct the shape, the size, and the number of its teeth, just as the model shows. Viewed from the top, its head was not very narrow and had a certain width. In particular, there was a certain distance between the two lacrimal horns. Its nostrils were large, and their openings should be close to the front, probably at this point. There was a bulge on its cheekbones that extended to the front of the mouth, which was also a striking facial feature of Carcharodontosaurids. The back of its head sloped down and had a very large temporal fenestra. When it was alive, its temporal fenestra was probably filled with muscles like that of a python. If the animal is healthy, this part might look very plump. Moving backward, let's take a look at its neck. Its neck was not particularly long. If being straightened, its neck might be almost as long as its skull, perhaps slightly longer. While alive, it took on an S shape. Its neck was thick. According to the modern reconstruction, its shoulder blades were rotated, so that the coracoid and the front of the shoulder blades that connected the neck muscles were all facing the front, causing the neck to look thicker, just like many modern animals with heavier heads, such as rhinoceros or horses. To match its powerful bite force, a thick neck was also a very necessary anatomical feature. The very striking feature was the special thick and tall neural spines that made up the sail-like structure. According to the skeletons, its neural spines were a bit like Spinosaurus, but not that exaggerated, about less than half the length of Spinosaurus, but still exaggerated. When alive, its neural spines weren't the sail-like structure of Spinosaurus, but with a large number of muscles attached to its sides. Currently, there is no good conclusion about what role it played or why it grew like that. But it's very likely that when this carnivorous dinosaur grew to this size, the muscles fixed on both sides of its back were very important structures to stabilize its body. Unlike hadrosaurs or iguanodonts having ossified tendons on both sides for reinforcement, they probably relied on powerful muscles to make their bodies stronger. Acrocanthosaurus was relatively sturdy, which differs from the previous belief that animals other than tyrannosaurs were not sturdy, because now we can use a lot of new equipment to reconstruct the original appearance of the fossils flattened by formation forces. Therefore, we can infer that this dinosaur was very wide viewed from the front. We can also reconstruct all the muscles of its back with the current knowledge of anatomy. Its ribs on the dorsal side were in this state, so there were a lot of muscles in the concave on this side, filling up to the top of its neural spines, which was sloping down like this instead of bulging, as the model shows. The muscles of its back ran all the way from the neck to the front of its pelvis. The muscles on the upper side might extend all the way to the tail, and the muscles on the lower side extended from the pelvis to form the upper and lower sets of muscles on the tail. Just now we mentioned that these two groups constituted the upper muscles, and the muscles at the lower end of its tail extended from the pelvis. If looking from the side, we can see a clear boundary along the direction of the transverse process of the caudal vertebrae, which was the key point to separate the upper and lower groups of muscles. The legs of Acrocanthosaurus were very stout and relatively long. When the not well-preserved fossils were discovered in the past, people speculated that its legs were a little shorter than they looked now, but the present better fossils can help us reconstruct its normal appearance, and we know its legs were relatively long. People have found suspected footprints that belong to Acrocanthosaurus, and its leg length and its stride can correspond to its footprints. Acrocanthosaurus had very short forelimbs, a common feature of many Carcharodontosaurids. People usually think that the forelimbs of Tyrannosaurus rex were the smallest. In fact, the forelimbs of T. rex were almost close to those of many Carcharodontosaurids in proportion, although not as robust as theirs. The finger number of T. rex was fewer. Carcharodontosaurids, especially Acrocanthosaurus, had 3 fingers on their forelimbs, a structure they inherited from Jurassic carnivorous dinosaurs. We look at the finger pads of these 3 fingers from the inside. When reconstructing this model, we adopted the way that one pad corresponded to one bone. Therefore, we can see the number of its phalanges from the pads. The first finger had 1, the second finger had 2, and the third finger had 3. It had relatively large claws. The first claw was larger, the second smaller, and the third the smallest, which was very short. It's worth noting that its finger pads were not as developed as those of the birds that can grasp a branch. Many birds have large bumps on the front of the pads of their claws, which help them hold branches for a long time. But many dinosaurs didn't have this feature. Therefore, from this model, we can see that its finger pads were relatively flat, which is deduced from its claw fossils. Some dinosaurs, such as Therizinosaurus, had their claws close to those of birds. The roots of its claws were connected to the upper part so that after the bones were connected, the end of the claw had a larger protrusion to accommodate a larger pad. But dinosaurs like Acrocanthosaurus, their front claws were connected to a relatively lower position, causing its whole finger to be a smooth transition. Moreover, its forelimbs were relatively small, with a limited range of movement, which made it unable to grasp strongly, so we reconstructed it like this. Besides, let's look at its feet. We can see that the reconstructed toe pads on the soles adopted the same way. Its first toe had a very large pad, the second toe had 2, and the third toe also had 2. There were some scales on the soles, which were very small, and we may not be able to see them clearly on the model. These scales were found on the footprints of many dinosaurs. The soles of dinosaurs had scales, which is different from the previous speculation that they were scaleless and relatively smooth. But most footprint fossils do not preserve it, because footprint fossils tend to be formed in relatively muddy environments. Good, the above are some introductions about Fergus the Acrocanthosaurus. Thank you all.